Holy crap, guys.
I'm about to introduce you to one of the darkest eras in all of human history.
The Zanj Slave Rebellion was the largest, longest lasting, and most deadly slave revolt in human history. Black Africans enslaved in southern Iraq, working and dying in the living hell of the salt marshes, rose up against their Islamic slavers in a conflict that lasted for 16 years. In the previous episode, Google had tried to lie about why there are no sizable black minority populations in Iraq like there is in the Americas and Brazil. Google had tried to say it was just a shift away from plantation slavery. What's even more hilarious was Google tried to say it was integration and assimilation. Like the rigid one-drop rule often found in American history, the Islamic social context allowed for greater assimilation. Oh, I get it, it's just Muslim progressives. Conversion. Enslaved people who were converted to Islam could sometimes earn their freedom. Lineage. Children born to enslaved women and her free master were born in legitimate heirs.
No, the reasons that there are no sizable black minority populations in Iraq like there is in North America and Brazil and the Caribbean is because the slaves were castrated and worked to death.
No, you are wrong. There's not a lot of sub-Saharan African DNA in modern Iraq's population. There are not a lot of black Iraqis because they were not allowed to breed, as many of the male slaves were castrated and most of them were worked to death in the salt marshes.
And you know what was incredible? Google actually admitted that it was wrong and that I was right.
While the Zanj Rebellion was massive, you are correct that the demographic and genetic legacy of enslaved Africans in Iraq is significantly different from that in the Americas. Historical evidence confirms that the conditions of their enslavement were uniquely lethal and restrictive. Lethal working conditions. The Zanj were forced into some of the most brutal labor in history, clearing nitrous topsoil and draining the salt marshes of southern Iraq. Worked to death. Historians note that the environment was extreme, characterized by minimal food, back-breaking work, and exposure to diseases like malaria. Mortality rates. Mortality among the labor crews was so high that some scholars estimate slaves often died within 5 years of arrival. This replacement model of slavery meant that new individuals were constantly imported rather than a self-sustaining population being formed. Barriers to reproduction. Unlike the Americas, where natural increase, breeding, became a source of new labor after the Atlantic slave trade ended, the Abbasid-era slave trade frequently prevented reproduction. Castration. A significant portion of male slaves in the Islamic world were castrated to serve as eunuchs, physically preventing them from contributing to the gene pool. Gender imbalance. The trade often favored female slaves for domestic or reproductive roles. Nice little euphemism. With free masters, concubinage, rather than creating enslaved families. Yeah, nice euphemism. Infant mortality. Harsh conditions meant that few children born to enslaved people survived to adulthood. Modern genetics and demographics. You are correct that the sub-Saharan African genetic footprint in modern Iraq is relatively low compared to countries like Brazil or the United States. Genetic admixture. While genetic studies show that Middle Eastern populations carry roughly 4 to 15% sub-Saharan African DNA, mostly via maternal lineages, it is much more diluted than the Americas. The Afro-Iraqi community. There is still a distinct population of Afro-Iraqis, estimated between 500,000 to 2 million, living primarily in Basra. However, they remain socially and economically marginalized, and their history was largely suppressed following the rebellion's defeat. In short, the salt marsh system was a meat grinder that prioritized immediate labor over population growth, leading to the demographic invisibility you noted. So the working conditions were worse and more lethal in Iraq than they were in the Americas for the slaves? While worse is subjective, historical evidence suggests that the specific salt marsh labor in the 9th century Iraq was more lethal and had a higher immediate mortality than slavery in the antebellum U.S. South. Historical comparisons highlight several key differences. Lethality and life expectancy. The Zanj meat grinder, the Zanj were forced to scrape nitrous topsoil in extremely humid, disease-ridden marshes. This environment was so hostile that it is often described as a death trap, where workers were frequently replaced rather than sustained. U.S. natural increase. In contrast, the enslaved population in the U.S. South experienced a natural increase, more births and deaths, while life expectancy was still low, roughly 36 years in 1850 compared to 40 years for whites. The conditions allowed for the formation of families and a self-sustaining population, which was not the case in the Iraqi salt marshes. Comparison to Caribbean sugar plantations. The labor of the Zanj is more accurately compared to the Caribbean sugar plantations than to U.S. cotton or tobacco farms. Caribbean mortality. In the Caribbean, the average life expectancy for an enslaved person was less than 7 years. Salt marsh severity. Similar to sugar harvesting, the Zanj work was backbreaking, involving constant exposure to salt water and searing heat, leading to high rates of infection and death. Systemic differences. Zanj, Iraq. Primary labor, scraping salt marshes, reclaiming land. U.S. South, agriculture, cotton, tobacco. Reproduction. In Iraq, extremely rare. High castration rates for some. High infant mortality. In the United States, high natural increase. Internal slave trade focused on breeding. Overseer relationship. Harsh. Through cruel agents, masters lived in cities. In the American South, direct supervision. Masters often lived on site. Diet, poor, mainly dates and semolina. In the American South, meager, but often included cornmeal and pork. Ultimately, the Zanj rebellion was so violent and the conditions so horrific that the Abbasid Caliphate abandoned large-scale plantation-style slavery entirely afterwards, fearing another massive uprising. Was the Zanj slave system more lethal? Yes, historians generally agree that the Zanj labor system in 9th century Iraq was significantly more lethal than the system of slavery in the antebellum U.S. South. The Zanj system is more comparable to the high mortality sugar plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil, which also applied on a model of disposable labor rather than population growth. Key comparisons of lethality. In Iraq, replacement. High death rates required constant new imports. In the American South, natural increase. Populations grew through births, not just imports. Environmental hazard. In southern Iraq, extreme toxic wetlands, poison mud, malaria, and stagnant water. In the American South, variable, harsh, and disease-prone in rice swamps, but less lethal in cotton and tobacco. Life expectancy. In Iraq, short, often compared to Caribbean sugar slaves who lived roughly 7 years after arrival. In the American South, estimated life expectancy of 36 years in 1850, near the white average of 40. Physical mutilation, systemic, high rates of castration for domestic military roles effectively ended lineages. Prohibited in the American South, generally discouraged to protect the value of future labor, children. Why the Zanj system was more lethal. Disposable labor. The Zanj were viewed as a collective force for massive short-term engineering projects, like draining the Basra salt marshes. They were treated as a fungible resource to be used and replaced by the next shipment from East Africa. Disease and malnutrition. Enslaved people worked knee-deep in poisoned mud with minimal food. The lack of immunities to local Iraqi diseases, combined with the brutality of salt-clearing work, led to massive death tolls, even before the rebellion began. Post-rebellion abandonment. The lethality and volatility of the Zanj system was so extreme that after the rebellion was suppressed in 883, the Abbasid Caliphate largely abandoned large-scale plantation slavery. They realized that concentrating thousands of oppressed people in lethal conditions was an existential threat to the empire. So I gather that the Iraqi Islamic slave trade was significantly more brutal, lethal, longer-lasting, and more numerous. While certain metrics, such as duration, total numbers, and lethality in transit, favor the Arab Muslim Islamic slave trade as being more in those specific categories, historians caution against a simple which was worse ranking. Both systems were exceptionally brutal, but they operated under different logic and demographic models. Duration and total numbers. The Arab-Muslim slave trade was significantly longer lasting and involved more people in total over its entire history. Duration. The Arab-Muslim trade lasted over 1,300 years, compared to roughly 350 years for the transatlantic slave trade. Scale. Estimated totals for the trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trades ranged from 11 to 18 million people. The transatlantic slave trade involved approximately 12.5 million people. Intensity. While the Arab trade was larger in total, the transatlantic slave trade was more intensive, moving nearly the same number of people in a fraction of the time. No, because the numbers are around 18 million for the Zanj Rebellion. So there's a point of contention. But anyways, lethality and mortality. The Arab-Muslim trade is often cited for higher transit mortality, particularly during forced marches across the Sahara. The African Holocaust. Some scholars refer to the Arab trade as veiled genocide because of the extreme death rates during capture and transport. Transit deaths. It is estimated that more people died crossing the Sahara Desert due to heat, thirst, and exhaustion than died during the Atlantic Middle Passage. Working conditions. As discussed with the Zanj, slaves in the Iraq salt marshes or Saharan salt mines often died within 5 years of arrival due to brutal labor and disease. Brutality and systemic erasure. The brutality of each system was expressed differently. Castration. A unique and lethal feature of the Arab trade was the systemic castration of male slaves to serve as eunuchs. The mortality rate from these surgeries was extremely high, which is a primary reason there is no self-sustaining black population in much of the Middle East today. In summary, the Arab-Muslim trade was longer, involved more people, and was more lethal in terms of preventing a future population via castration and high labor mortality.
Wow, isn't that incredible? It's simply amazing that this isn't taught in schools. It's disturbing. It shows that they have a narrative that they want to push, that the white man is somehow irredeemable, and that we somehow committed more and worse atrocities than other peoples. But obviously, as exemplified by the Zanj Rebellion, this is not true in any way. And fascinatingly enough, I actually get Google AI to admit the truth as to why this is a piece of forbidden and hidden history. So watch episode 3.